The boardroom fell silent as the newest member of the executive team entered. No grand announcements preceded his arrival, no flamboyant displays of authority marked his presence. He simply walked to his designated chair, settled into it with deliberate calm, and waited. The other executives, accustomed to filling every moment with chatter, explanations, and justifications, found themselves unconsciously adjusting their posture under his steady gaze. This was the beginning of a transformation that would reshape not only the dynamics of that corporate environment but also serve as a living example of a fundamental truth about human psychology. Silence, when wielded with intention and backed by inner strength, becomes one of the most potent forms of power available to the human mind. The concept of strategic silence as a tool of influence extends far beyond simple quietude. It represents a sophisticated understanding of human nature, social dynamics, and the psychological mechanisms that drive fear, respect, and obedience. When an individual has truly conquered their weaker self, those aspects of personality driven by insecurity, need for validation, and emotional reactivity, they gain access to a form of power that cannot be taken from them by external forces. The executive who entered that boardroom had not always possessed such command over himself or his environment. Years earlier, he had been like most people, reactive, eager to prove himself, quick to fill uncomfortable silences with unnecessary words. He had operated from a place of internal weakness, constantly seeking approval and validation from others. His transformation began with a single realization that would fundamentally alter his approach to life and leadership. The realization came during a particularly challenging period in his career when a hostile takeover threatened to eliminate his position entirely. Faced with the prospect of professional destruction, he found himself at a crossroads. He could continue operating from his familiar patterns of anxiety, over-explanation, and desperate attempts to control outcomes through verbal persuasion, or he could choose a radically different path. The path he chose was one of deliberate silence and strategic withdrawal from the emotional chaos surrounding him. Instead of engaging in the frantic maneuvering and political machinations that consumed his colleagues, he became an observer. He studied the dynamics at play, watched how fear and desperation drove others to make increasingly poor decisions, and began to understand something profound about human nature. People feared silence because it forced them to confront their own thoughts and insecurities. In the absence of external validation or direction, individuals were left alone with their doubts and anxieties. The executive realized that by remaining silent in strategic moments, he could create psychological pressure that revealed the true motivations and weaknesses of those around him. This was not about manipulation in the crude sense, but rather about understanding the fundamental dynamics of power and influence. When someone has truly overcome their own need for constant validation and approval, their silence carries weight because it cannot be interpreted as insecurity or uncertainty. It becomes a form of communication that speaks louder than words. The psychological mechanisms underlying this phenomenon are rooted in basic human social programming. Throughout evolutionary history, silence from a position of strength has signaled confidence, control, and potential threat. When combined with an individual who has genuinely transcended their weaker impulses, this silence becomes particularly unsettling to those who still operate from places of internal weakness. During the corporate crisis, the executive implemented his newfound understanding systematically. When accused of incompetence by a rival, instead of launching into defensive explanations, he remained silent, maintaining steady eye contact until the accuser began to stumble over their own words. When asked to justify his strategies in heated meetings, he would pause for long moments before responding with concise, well-considered statements that carried far more impact than lengthy justifications. The effect was immediate and profound. Colleagues began to interpret his silence as evidence of hidden knowledge or strategic thinking. Competitors found themselves second-guessing their own positions when confronted with his calm, unreactive presence. Most importantly, senior leadership began to view him as someone who possessed an unusual degree of self-control and strategic thinking. But the true power of his transformation lay not in these external effects, but in the internal revolution that had taken place. By conquering his need for constant validation and approval, he had eliminated the primary vulnerabilities that others could exploit. When someone no longer fears rejection, criticism, or social isolation, they become extraordinarily difficult to control or manipulate. This internal transformation is perhaps the most crucial aspect of developing true power through silence. It requires a complete reconstruction of one's relationship with external validation and approval. Most people operate from a fundamental fear of rejection or abandonment, which makes them susceptible to various forms of social and psychological manipulation. They will compromise their values, abandon their goals, and betray their authentic selves rather than risk losing the approval of others. The process of overcoming these weaknesses is neither quick nor comfortable. It requires confronting the deepest insecurities and fears that drive human behavior. For the executive, this meant examining why he had spent so many years seeking approval from others, why he feared conflict, and why he felt compelled to fill every silence with unnecessary words. He discovered that his patterns were rooted in childhood experiences of conditional love and approval. Like many people, he had learned early that his worth was tied to others' opinions of him. This conditioning had shaped his adult behavior, making him reactive to criticism and desperate for validation. Breaking free from these patterns required a systematic process of self-examination and deliberate behavior modification. The first step was developing what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to remain calm and centered in the face of uncomfortable emotions or situations. This meant learning to sit with anxiety, uncertainty, and social pressure without immediately reacting to alleviate the discomfort. When colleagues criticized his ideas, instead of immediately defending himself, he practiced sitting with the discomfort of their disapproval. Initially, this was extraordinarily difficult. Every instinct urged him to explain, justify, or counterattack. But, gradually, as he practiced remaining silent and centered during these challenging moments, he began to notice something remarkable. The criticism and attacks of others lost their power over him. What had once felt like devastating assaults on his worth became merely noise, unpleasant perhaps, but ultimately harmless. This transformation in his relationship with external criticism had profound effects on his interactions with others. When someone is genuinely unmoved by criticism or disapproval, their presence becomes unsettling to those who are still trapped in approval-seeking behaviors. The executive found that his calm silence in the face of attacks often caused his critics to escalate their efforts, ultimately revealing their own desperation and weakness. The psychological principle at work here is that people project their own internal states onto others. Those who are driven by insecurity assume that others share their vulnerabilities. When confronted with someone who genuinely does not react to their usual tactics of criticism, intimidation, or social pressure, they often become confused and anxious themselves. During one particularly memorable board meeting, a senior partner launched a sustained attack on the executive's recent project performance. Instead of responding with data, explanations, or counter-arguments, the executive simply sat quietly, maintaining calm eye contact throughout the tirade. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the room waited for his response. When it became clear that no response was forthcoming, the attacking partner began to fill the silence with increasingly desperate justifications for his criticism. What had begun as a confident assault gradually transformed into nervous rambling as the partner struggled to maintain his position without any resistance to push against. The executive's silence had effectively turned the attacker's energy back upon himself, creating a psychological mirror that reflected the partner's own aggression and insecurity. The meeting ended with the attacking partner looking foolish and desperate, while the executive's reputation for strategic thinking and self-control was enhanced. But, perhaps more importantly, the executive felt no emotional disturbance from the encounter. The criticism had genuinely failed to affect his internal state, confirming that his transformation was real rather than merely performed. This incident illustrates a crucial principle of psychological warfare. The person who remains centered and unreactive holds tremendous advantages over those who are emotionally volatile. When someone has truly conquered their weaker self, they become like a martial artist who can redirect an opponent's energy rather than meeting force with force. The development of such inner strength requires understanding the difference between suppression and transcendence. Suppressing emotions or reactions simply pushes them underground, where they continue to influence behavior unconsciously. True transcendence involves fully experiencing and processing these emotions while maintaining conscious choice over one's responses. For the executive, this meant learning to feel anger, hurt, or frustration without automatically acting on these emotions. When criticized or attacked, he would allow himself to experience whatever emotions arose, acknowledge them internally, and then consciously choose his response based on strategic considerations rather than emotional reactivity. This process required developing what could be called emotional sovereignty, the ability to experience emotions without being controlled by them. Most people are slaves to their emotional reactions, automatically responding to triggers without conscious choice. Those who develop emotional sovereignty gain access to a much wider range of strategic options because they are not limited by their immediate emotional responses. The practice of strategic silence became one of the most powerful tools in the executive's arsenal, but it was effective precisely because it was backed by genuine inner strength rather than mere performance. True silence, the kind that inspires respect and even fear, cannot be faked. It emerges naturally from a state of inner completeness and self-sufficiency. This completeness is not about arrogance or superiority, but rather about having resolved the internal conflicts and insecurities that drive most human behavior. When someone no longer needs external validation to feel worthy, no longer fears rejection or abandonment, and no longer feels compelled to prove themselves to others, their presence naturally commands respect. The transformation process involves identifying and systematically addressing each source of internal weakness. For most people, these weaknesses fall into several categories: the need for approval, the fear of conflict, the compulsion to control outcomes, and the inability to tolerate uncertainty or discomfort. The need for approval is perhaps the most fundamental weakness that must be addressed. This need makes individuals susceptible to manipulation and prevents them from taking positions that might be unpopular but strategically necessary. Overcoming this need requires developing an internal source of validation and worth that is independent of others' opinions. The executive worked on this by deliberately taking positions that he knew would be unpopular but that he believed were correct. Initially, this caused significant anxiety as his approval-seeking mechanisms triggered powerful urges to modify his position or explain himself more palatably. But, by consistently choosing principle over popularity, he gradually weakened these patterns and developed genuine independence from others' approval. The fear of conflict is another major source of weakness that prevents many people from developing true power. Those who fear conflict will compromise their values and abandon their goals rather than face direct confrontation. This makes them predictable and easy to manipulate because others know they will back down when pressed. Overcoming conflict avoidance requires understanding that conflict is not inherently negative. It is simply a natural result of different perspectives, goals, or values coming into contact. When someone can remain calm and centered during conflict, they often find that what initially appeared threatening was actually manageable and, sometimes even beneficial. The executive practiced this by gradually engaging in conflicts that he had previously avoided. Instead of immediately seeking compromise or retreat when faced with opposition, he learned to stand his ground calmly and see what developed. He discovered that many apparent conflicts resolved themselves when met with quiet strength rather than anxious appeasement. The compulsion to control outcomes represents another significant source of weakness. Those who feel they must control everything around them become anxious and reactive when circumstances don't unfold according to their plans. This reactivity makes them vulnerable to those who can manipulate circumstances to trigger their control needs. Learning to influence while releasing attachment to specific outcomes requires a fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of trying to force particular results, the focus becomes on responding optimally to whatever circumstances arise. This paradoxically often leads to better outcomes because responses remain strategic rather than emotionally driven. The executive applied this principle during the corporate crisis by focusing on his own choices and responses rather than trying to control the complex political dynamics surrounding him. Instead of engaging in desperate maneuvering to prevent the takeover, he concentrated on positioning himself as indispensable regardless of the outcome. This approach ultimately led to his promotion within the new organizational structure. The ability to tolerate uncertainty and discomfort is perhaps the most fundamental skill underlying all others. Most people's weaknesses stem from their inability to sit with uncomfortable emotions or ambiguous situations. They will make poor decisions, compromise their values, and abandon strategic positions simply to alleviate temporary discomfort. Developing distress tolerance involves gradually exposing oneself to increasing levels of discomfort while maintaining centeredness. This might mean sitting quietly with anxiety rather than immediately taking action to relieve it, or remaining in uncertain situations rather than forcing premature closure. For the executive, this practice became a daily discipline. When faced with situations that triggered his desire to act immediately or explain himself, he would pause and sit with the discomfort until it naturally dissipated. Over time, his tolerance for uncertainty and social pressure increased dramatically. The cumulative effect of addressing these various weaknesses was a fundamental transformation in the executive's presence and effectiveness. He no longer radiated the subtle desperation that characterizes those who need external validation. His silence carried weight because it emerged from genuine confidence rather than performed composure. This transformation had effects that extended far beyond professional success. In his personal relationships, he found that his newfound centeredness attracted higher quality connections while naturally filtering out those who were drawn to weakness or codependence. His family relationships improved as he stopped seeking their approval and began relating to them from a place of genuine strength and love. The principle that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others proved itself repeatedly in his experience. Because he no longer depended on external circumstances for his sense of worth or security, he became remarkably resilient to the various forms of attack and manipulation that life inevitably brings. Competitors could no longer destabilize him with criticism because he had developed genuine self-knowledge that made external judgments largely irrelevant. Political maneuvering around him became less effective because he was no longer driven by the fears and desires that made others predictable. Most importantly, his calm strength in challenging situations inspired confidence in those around him, creating natural leadership opportunities. The psychological mechanisms behind this transformation reveal important truths about human nature and social dynamics. Fear and respect are often closely related emotions, both involving recognition of power. The difference is that fear typically involves recognizing power that feels threatening or unpredictable, while respect involves recognizing power that feels controlled and principled. When someone has genuinely conquered their weaker self, their power feels particularly worthy of respect because it appears to be self-generated rather than dependent on external circumstances. Others sense that this person's strength cannot be taken away through ordinary means, which creates a natural inclination to seek their good opinion rather than trying to diminish them. This dynamic reversal is one of the most remarkable aspects of the transformation. Instead of seeking others' approval, the transformed individual finds that others naturally seek theirs. Instead of fearing social rejection, they discover that their selective social engagement becomes more valued. Instead of trying to control others, they find that their influence increases through modeling rather than manipulation. The journey from weakness to strength is not a destination but an ongoing process. Even after significant transformation, new challenges arise that test and further develop one's capabilities. The executive found that each crisis or difficult situation became an opportunity to deepen his understanding and strengthen his inner foundation. Years later, as he reflected on his transformation, he realized that the most significant change was not in his external circumstances but in his relationship with himself. He had learned to be his own source of validation, security, and strength. This self-reliance was not about isolation or independence from others, but about engaging with the world from a position of wholeness rather than need. The silence that had become such a powerful tool in his repertoire was not really about withholding speech, but about speaking from a place of choice rather than compulsion. When he did speak, his words carried more weight because they emerged from careful consideration rather than reactive impulse. When he chose silence, it communicated confidence and strategic thinking rather than uncertainty or withdrawal. This mastery of communication, knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to use both strategically, became one of his most valuable skills. In a world where most people either speak too much from nervousness or remain silent from fear, the ability to use both speech and silence consciously creates tremendous advantages. The fear that his presence inspired in some people was not the fear of a tyrant or bully, but the discomfort that weaker individuals feel when confronted with genuine strength. Just as physical weakness feels uncomfortable around physical strength, psychological weakness feels threatened by psychological mastery. This is not about superiority or judgment, but simply about the natural dynamics that emerge when different levels of development come into contact. Those who recognized and respected his transformation often sought him out as a mentor or advisor. They could sense that he had solved problems that still plagued them: the need for constant validation, the fear of conflict, the compulsion to control outcomes. His presence served as proof that such transformation was possible, which both inspired and challenged them. The obedience that others showed toward him was not the compliance of the dominated, but the natural deference that people show toward those they recognize as being more developed or capable. When someone has clearly done the inner work necessary to master themselves, others naturally look to them for guidance and leadership. This form of influence is far more sustainable and satisfying than power based on position, wealth, or coercion. It cannot be taken away by external circumstances because it is rooted in internal development rather than external advantages. Even if stripped of all external resources and status, someone who has truly conquered their weaker self retains their essential power. The document of this transformation serves as both record and guide for others seeking similar development. The principles involved developing distress tolerance, overcoming approval seeking, embracing conflict when necessary, releasing attachment to outcomes, and using silence strategically can be applied by anyone willing to do the necessary inner work. But perhaps the most important lesson from this journey is that true power is not about dominating others, but about mastering oneself. When someone achieves genuine self-mastery, they naturally inspire both respect and a healthy form of fear in others. This fear is not about intimidation or threat, but about the discomfort that unconscious individuals feel when confronted with conscious presence. The transformation from weakness to strength, from reactivity to responsiveness, from need to wholeness, represents one of the most fundamental journeys available to human consciousness. It is a path that few choose because it requires confronting everything about oneself that feels comfortable and familiar. But, for those who persist, the rewards extend far beyond personal benefit to encompass everything they touch. In the end, silence becomes power not because of any technique or strategy, but because it emerges from a state of being that has transcended the normal human drives for approval, control, and external validation. When someone has truly destroyed their weaker self, those aspects driven by fear, insecurity, and reactive emotion, they gain access to a form of influence and presence that cannot be destroyed by others because it exists independently of external circumstances. This is the ultimate freedom, to be unmovable by criticism, unshakable in purpose, and undefeatable by external opposition because the foundation of one's strength lies within rather than without. From this foundation, both silence and speech become tools of conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion, creating possibilities for influence and leadership that serve not only the individual but all those whose lives they touch. Part 2: The Architecture of Internal Sovereignty. The transformation that began in corporate boardrooms would prove to be merely the foundation for a much deeper reconstruction of consciousness itself. What had initially appeared to be a collection of useful techniques, strategic silence, emotional regulation, independence from approval, revealed itself as elements of a comprehensive system for human development that had been understood by various traditions throughout history. The executive's journey into this deeper understanding began when he encountered others who possessed similar qualities of unshakable centeredness. These individuals came from various backgrounds. Some were business leaders, others were teachers, artists, or simply people who had found ways to live with unusual authenticity and strength. What they shared was not any particular belief system or methodology, but rather a quality of presence that suggested they had solved fundamental problems about human existence. Through careful observation and conversation with these individuals, he began to understand that his transformation had followed patterns that were both universal and predictable. The conquest of weakness and the development of internal sovereignty proceeded through recognizable stages, each building upon the previous one, each requiring specific understanding and practice. The first stage, which he had already completed, involved recognizing and breaking free from the most obvious forms of external dependence: the need for approval, the fear of conflict, the compulsion to control outcomes. This stage was primarily about identifying and interrupting automatic patterns of reaction that had been programmed through years of social conditioning. The second stage, which he was now entering, required a much deeper examination of the unconscious beliefs and assumptions that shaped perception itself. It was not enough to manage reactions to circumstances. True sovereignty required understanding how one's interpretation of circumstances was itself shaped by largely unconscious programming. This stage began with a disturbing realization. Despite his newfound ability to remain calm under pressure and his freedom from obvious approval-seeking behaviors, he discovered that his perception of reality was still heavily filtered through unconscious assumptions about himself, others, and life itself. These assumptions were so fundamental that they had been invisible to him, yet they were shaping every aspect of his experience. For example, he realized that despite his professional success, he still unconsciously believed that he needed to prove his worth through achievement. This belief was so deeply embedded that he had never questioned it, yet it was driving him to pursue goals that brought little genuine satisfaction. The approval seeking had been eliminated on the surface, but it continued to operate at deeper levels through his compulsive need to accomplish and achieve. Similarly, he discovered that his relationships were still shaped by unconscious fears of abandonment and rejection. While he no longer consciously sought others' approval, he was still unconsciously managing his presentation and behavior to avoid triggering their disapproval. The fear had become more sophisticated, but it was still fundamentally controlling his choices. Most significantly, he began to see that his entire sense of identity was constructed around maintaining a particular image of himself as someone who was strong, capable, and in control. This image had become another form of prison, limiting his authentic expression and creating constant pressure to live up to an idealized version of himself. The recognition of these deeper patterns was initially destabilizing. It meant that much of what he had considered to be genuine transformation was actually just a more sophisticated form of the same underlying dynamics. But this realization also opened the door to a much more profound level of freedom. The work of the second stage involved systematically examining and deconstructing these unconscious beliefs and assumptions. This was not an intellectual exercise but a lived process of catching himself in the act of operating from these hidden programs and choosing differently in real time. One of the most powerful tools for this work was the practice of radical honesty with himself about his actual motivations and experiences. Instead of maintaining the comfortable fiction that he was acting from purely rational or principled motives, he began to examine the emotional and psychological drives that were actually influencing his choices. This practice revealed the extent to which even his most apparently noble or strategic decisions were still being driven by unconscious needs for validation, security, or control. The realization was humbling, but it also provided the raw material for genuine transformation rather than mere behavioral modification. The process of deconstructing these deeper patterns required developing what could be called meta-awareness, the ability to observe not just one's thoughts and emotions, but the underlying structures that shape thought and emotion themselves. This meant becoming aware of awareness itself, recognizing the fundamental processes by which experience was created and maintained. Through consistent practice of this meta-awareness, he began to see that what he had taken to be solid reality was actually a constantly changing flow of perceptions, interpretations, and reactions. His sense of himself as a separate, solid entity began to feel more like a collection of habits and patterns than an unchanging truth. This recognition was initially disorienting. If his sense of self was not as solid as he had believed, then what was he really? What was the source of the strength and centeredness that he had developed? Was his transformation real, or was it simply another form of self-deception? The answer came through direct experience rather than intellectual understanding. As he continued to observe the construction and dissolution of his various self-concepts, he began to recognize something that remained constant throughout all the changes. There was an awareness that was present regardless of what particular thoughts, emotions, or identities were arising and passing away. This awareness was not personal in the usual sense. It was not his awareness as opposed to someone else's, but rather the fundamental capacity for consciousness itself. Yet it was intimately present and immediate, closer than thoughts, emotions, or sensations, yet not limited by any of them. The recognition of this deeper dimension of being provided the foundation for a completely different understanding of strength and power. Instead of being based on developing and maintaining particular qualities or capabilities, true sovereignty was revealed to be a matter of recognizing what was already and always present, the unchanging awareness that was the source of all experience. This recognition had immediate practical implications. When he encountered situations that would previously have triggered his defensive patterns, he found that there was a place he could rest that was untouched by whatever was happening in the content of experience. This was not about suppressing or transcending difficult experiences, but about recognizing the space in which all experiences arose and passed away. From this perspective, the silence that had been such a powerful tool revealed its true nature. It was not really about withholding speech or creating strategic advantage, but about resting in the fundamental silence that was always present, the still, aware space that was the background of all experience. When communication emerged from this deeper silence, it carried a quality that was entirely different from speech that arose from personality, strategy, or emotional reaction. It was more like the silence itself speaking, and it had an authority and authenticity that commanded natural respect. Similarly, the fearlessness that others perceived in him was not really about courage in the face of danger, but about recognizing that there was nothing that could ultimately be threatened. The awareness that he truly was could not be harmed by criticism, rejection, failure, or even death. From this recognition, apparent threats lost their power to create fear or anxiety. This was not a philosophical understanding but a lived reality that was tested repeatedly in increasingly challenging circumstances. As word of his unusual capabilities spread, he found himself in situations that would have previously overwhelmed him. Corporate battles became more intense, personal relationships became more demanding, and the stakes of his decisions increased dramatically. Yet instead of feeling increased pressure, he experienced greater ease and effectiveness. The challenges that arose seemed to call forth capacities he hadn't known he possessed. His responses to difficult situations became more creative, more appropriate, and more effective, yet they felt effortless rather than forced. He began to understand that this was because he was no longer trying to maintain or defend any particular position. When someone is not attached to being right, being respected, being successful, or being anything in particular, they can respond to situations based purely on what is most appropriate and effective. The energy that had previously gone into maintaining self-image became available for creative response to circumstances. This shift had profound effects on his relationships with others. People began to respond to him differently, often in ways that surprised both him and them. Those who had previously seen him as a competitor or threat began to seek his counsel and support. Those who had dismissed him as irrelevant began to pay attention to his contributions. The change was not in what he said or did, but in the quality of presence from which his words and actions emerged. When someone is truly resting in their fundamental being rather than operating from personality or agenda, others sense this at an unconscious level. They feel safe in a way that they rarely experience with others, even when they cannot articulate why. This safety was not about predictability or niceness, but about recognizing that they were in the presence of someone who was not trying to get anything from them. Most human interactions are colored by various forms of need for validation, for advantage, for emotional regulation. When these needs are absent, the interaction can unfold in entirely new ways. The executive found that his influence expanded not through any effort on his part, but as a natural consequence of this shift in being. People sought his opinion not because he promoted himself, but because they sensed that his perspective emerged from a place that was free from the usual distortions of personal agenda and emotional reactivity. The obedience that others showed toward him became more nuanced as well. It was not blind compliance, but rather the natural response of intelligence recognizing greater intelligence, of wisdom recognizing deeper wisdom. Those who were themselves committed to truth and effectiveness naturally aligned with someone who embodied these qualities more fully. Yet perhaps the most significant change was in his own experience of existence. Life became simultaneously more intense and more peaceful. Problems that would have previously consumed enormous amounts of energy and attention were resolved with simple, direct responses. Complicated situations revealed simple solutions. Difficult people became opportunities for practice rather than sources of stress. This was not because external circumstances became easier, but because the internal reactivity that had complicated every situation was no longer present. When someone is not defending anything, not seeking anything, and not avoiding anything, they can perceive and respond to situations with remarkable clarity and efficiency. The fear that he inspired in some people during this phase was different from the earlier variety. Previously, people had sensed his strength and self-control, which made them cautious about trying to manipulate or control him. Now they sensed something that was beyond manipulation entirely, a presence that could not be reached by their usual methods of influence. This was unsettling to those who were accustomed to being able to affect others through emotional manipulation, social pressure, or various forms of psychological leverage. They found that their usual tactics not only failed to work, but seemed to be absorbed without creating any reactive charge whatsoever. Some people interpreted this quality as coldness or indifference, but those who looked more carefully recognized it as a profound form of warmth and love. When someone is no longer driven by their own needs and fears, their capacity to respond to others from a place of genuine care and wisdom increases dramatically. The silence that characterized many of his interactions during this period was not the silence of withholding or judgment, but the silence of complete attention and presence. Others found themselves speaking more truthfully in his presence, revealing concerns and insights that they normally kept hidden. His silence created a space where truth could emerge naturally. This quality of attention became one of his most powerful tools for influence and support. In a world where genuine attention is increasingly rare, the experience of being truly seen and heard by another person is extraordinarily valuable. People would often leave conversations with him feeling clearer about their own lives and more confident in their own wisdom. The transformation that had begun as a strategy for professional effectiveness had evolved into a comprehensive restructuring of consciousness itself. What emerged was not a more effective personality, but a recognition of what was beyond personality altogether, the fundamental awareness that was the source of all experience. From this foundation, power and influence flowed naturally rather than being sought or developed. Leadership became a matter of serving what was needed rather than pursuing what was desired. Relationships became opportunities for mutual recognition and support rather than transactions for meeting personal needs. The destruction of his weaker self had revealed itself to be not really destruction at all, but rather the recognition of what was false and the unveiling of what was eternally true. The self that could be destroyed by others was revealed to be a collection of beliefs, images, and defensive patterns. The self that could not be destroyed was recognized as the unchanging awareness that was the ground of being itself. This recognition provided unshakable security not because it was another form of strength to be developed, but because it revealed what had always been invulnerable. From this perspective, external circumstances became opportunities for expression rather than sources of threat. Other people became fellow expressions of the same fundamental consciousness rather than potential enemies or sources of validation. The practical implications of this recognition extended into every aspect of life. Decision-making became simpler because choices were no longer filtered through complicated webs of personal preference and aversion. Communication became more effective because it emerged from clarity rather than agenda. Leadership became more natural because it was based on service to truth rather than pursuit of position. Yet perhaps most importantly, the journey itself became the destination. Instead of seeking some future state of completion or achievement, each moment became an opportunity for deeper recognition and more authentic expression. The path of transformation revealed itself to be endless, not in the sense of never reaching satisfaction, but in the sense of continually discovering deeper dimensions of truth and possibility. The man who had entered that boardroom years earlier, driven by unconscious needs for validation and control, had been transformed into someone who could hardly be called the same person. Yet the essence of what he truly was had not changed at all, it had simply been recognized and allowed to express itself without the interference of false programming and defensive patterns. This paradox, that profound transformation could occur without anything fundamental changing, became a source of both humor and wonder. The journey that had seemed so difficult and complex was revealed to be a matter of stopping doing what had never been necessary in the first place. Part 3, the emergence of authentic power. The final stage of transformation began not with effort or intention, but with a profound relaxation, a letting go so complete that it seemed to dissolve the very one who had been seeking transformation. What emerged from this dissolution was something that could hardly be called personal power, though its effects on others and circumstances were undeniable. Years had passed since the executive's initial awakening to the possibilities of strategic silence and emotional sovereignty. The practices and understandings that had once required constant attention and effort had become as natural as breathing. The meta-awareness that had initially demanded such concentration now operated effortlessly in the background of experience, providing continuous insight into the construction and dissolution of thoughts, emotions, and perceptions. But something new was stirring, a recognition that even the one who had achieved such mastery was itself another construction, another layer of identity that was preventing the emergence of something far more fundamental and powerful. This recognition came not through analysis or practice, but through a series of encounters with situations that challenged every assumption about power, control, and influence that remained. The first of these occurred during a corporate merger that threatened to eliminate not just his position, but the entire division he had come to lead. Initially, he responded from his well-developed capacity for non-reactive assessment and strategic thinking. He analyzed the situation, identified leverage points, and began to formulate responses that would protect his interests and those of his team. But, as the situation unfolded, he found himself in territory that seemed to require something entirely different from anything he had previously developed. The merger was being driven by forces that were largely invisible and immune to traditional forms of influence. Financial pressures, regulatory requirements, and strategic imperatives at levels far above his position were creating momentum that seemed unstoppable. His usual tools of silence, presence, and strategic thinking felt inadequate to the magnitude of the changes taking place. It was during a particularly challenging board meeting, where the decision seemed to have already been made to eliminate his entire operation, that something unprecedented occurred. Instead of engaging his sophisticated toolkit of influence and persuasion, he found himself simply present with the situation as it was, without any agenda to change it. This was not resignation or defeat, but rather a quality of attention that was completely available to what was actually happening rather than focused on what he wanted to happen. From this state of pure presence, he began to see possibilities and connections that had been invisible while he was focused on controlling outcomes. The conversation in the room began to shift in subtle ways. Questions that hadn't been asked were suddenly being explored. Assumptions that had seemed fixed began to be examined. Options that hadn't been considered started to emerge. He said very little, but his quality of attention seemed to be calling forth intelligence and creativity from others. By the end of the meeting, what had seemed like an inevitable closure had transformed into an opportunity for innovation and expansion. The decision was made not only to preserve his operation, but to use it as a model for restructuring other parts of the organization. The transformation had occurred not through his influence, but through his willingness to be fully present with reality as it was. This incident marked the beginning of his recognition that true power might have little to do with personal capabilities or strategic thinking. Instead, it seemed to emerge from a quality of being that was available when the personal self stepped aside completely, allowing intelligence and creativity to operate without the interference of agenda and control. The implications of this recognition were both liberating and disorienting. If his most effective moments were characterized by the absence of his personal involvement, what did that mean about all the skills and capacities he had developed? What was the role of the self in the expression of genuine power? The answer came through direct experience over the following months. He began to notice that his most impactful interactions occurred when he was least conscious of trying to have impact. His most influential communications emerged when he was simply responding to what seemed most true and appropriate, without concern for how others would receive his words. This was not about abandoning responsibility or ceasing to care about outcomes, but rather about recognizing that the most effective action often arose from a place that was beyond personal motivation. When the machinery of agenda, strategy, and control was set aside, something far more intelligent and appropriate could emerge. The process of learning to operate from this deeper source required unlearning much of what he had previously mastered. The strategic use of silence, for example, had to give way to a more organic relationship with communication. Speech and silence began to arise naturally based on what the situation called for, rather than being deployed as tools for achieving particular effects. This shift was initially challenging because it meant giving up the sense of control and predictability that his previous mastery had provided. There was no guarantee that the appropriate response would emerge, no systematic approach that could be relied upon. Each moment required a fresh willingness to not know what was needed until it became clear. Yet as he learned to trust this process, he discovered that the responses that emerged were far more creative and effective than anything he could have planned or strategized. Solutions to complex problems would appear fully formed. The perfect thing to say in difficult situations would arise spontaneously. Actions that seemed risky or inappropriate from a planning perspective would prove to be exactly what was needed. This was not about intuition in the usual sense, but about allowing intelligence itself to operate without the interference of the personal mind. When the constructed self stepped aside, what remained was not emptiness but a fullness that contained infinite creative potential. The effects of this transformation on others became increasingly profound. People began to seek him out not for his advice or expertise, but for the quality of presence that emerged when he was with them. In his presence, they found that their own clarity and wisdom became more accessible. Problems that had seemed intractable would resolve themselves. Conflicts that had persisted for years would dissolve. This was not because he was doing anything to help them, but because his presence provided a space where truth could emerge naturally. When someone is completely present and available, without any agenda to fix or change anything, others feel safe to drop their defenses and connect with their own deeper knowing. The fear that he inspired during this period was of an entirely different quality from what had emerged during his earlier transformations. It was not the fear of strength or competence, but something closer to awe, the recognition of being in the presence of something that was beyond the usual categories of human experience. Some people found this deeply uncomfortable because it challenged their fundamental assumptions about power, identity, and control. They sensed that he was operating from a place that made their usual methods of understanding and influence irrelevant. This was threatening to those whose sense of security depended on being able to categorize and predict others. Yet for those who were ready to recognize it, his presence was profoundly inspiring. They could sense that he embodied possibilities that were available to all human beings but rarely actualized. He served as proof that the limitations they had accepted as inevitable were actually choices that could be transcended. The obedience that others showed toward him during this phase was not really obedience in the traditional sense, but rather the natural alignment that occurs when people recognize authentic wisdom and love. When someone is clearly operating from a place of genuine service to truth and well-being, others naturally want to support and follow their guidance. This was not about charisma or persuasion, but about the magnetic quality that emerges when personal agenda is completely absent. When someone truly wants nothing for themselves, others sense this and feel safe to align with their perspective and guidance. The corporate environment where his transformation had begun became a laboratory for exploring these new possibilities. His division became known for its unusual effectiveness and creativity. Teams that had been struggling with complex challenges would find elegant solutions after spending time in his presence. Conflicts between departments would resolve when he was invited to participate in conversations. Yet he was doing very little that could be identified as leadership in the conventional sense. He rarely gave directions, made decisions unilaterally, or imposed his will on others. Instead, he would listen deeply, ask questions that helped clarify what was actually needed, and trust that the appropriate responses would emerge from the collective intelligence of the group. This approach required tremendous trust in the fundamental intelligence and goodness that was available when people felt safe and supported. It meant believing that most problems were not actually problems to be solved, but misunderstandings to be clarified or conflicts to be resolved through deeper communication. The results of this approach were remarkable. Productivity increased not through pressure or incentives, but through people becoming genuinely engaged with work that felt meaningful and aligned with their deepest values. Innovation flourished because creativity was no longer constrained by fear of making mistakes or looking foolish. Most significantly, the quality of relationships throughout the organization transformed. The usual dynamics of competition, politics, and mutual manipulation gave way to genuine collaboration and mutual support. People began to bring their authentic selves to work rather than maintaining professional personas designed to protect their positions. This transformation spread beyond the immediate work environment. Other organizations began to study what was happening in his division, trying to understand and replicate the unusual results. Consultants and researchers visited to analyze the leadership methods and organizational structures that were producing such extraordinary outcomes. Yet what they found was difficult to quantify or systematize. There were no special techniques, unique policies, or innovative management structures. The difference seemed to lie in something much more subtle, a quality of presence and attention that created conditions where human potential could express itself naturally. This quality proved impossible to replicate through external methods because it emerged from an internal transformation that could not be copied or taught in the usual sense. It could only be recognized and cultivated through each individual's own journey of awakening to their fundamental nature. The recognition that his most powerful influence came through being rather than doing led to a complete reorientation of his understanding of success and achievement. Instead of pursuing goals and accumulating accomplishments, his focus shifted to simply being as present and authentic as possible in each moment. This was not about passive acceptance or withdrawal from engagement, but about approaching each situation with complete availability to what was actually needed rather than attachment to what he wanted to achieve. Paradoxically, this approach led to outcomes that far exceeded anything he had previously accomplished through effort and planning. The projects that emerged from this new way of operating were characterized by an effortless quality that made them seem inevitable in retrospect. Resources would appear exactly when needed. The right people would become available at the perfect time. Obstacles would dissolve as naturally as they had appeared. This was not about magical thinking or wishful hoping, but about aligning with the natural intelligence that was always operating beneath the surface of apparent complexity and conflict. When personal agenda was set aside, it became possible to see and work with the deeper currents that were actually moving situations toward their natural resolution. The silence that had been such a prominent feature of his earlier transformation evolved into something that could hardly be called silence at all. It was more like a quality of spaciousness that allowed whatever needed to emerge to do so without interference. Sometimes this manifested as physical silence, but just as often it was a speaking that came from silence, words that emerged from emptiness and returned to emptiness. This quality of communication had extraordinary effects on others. People would often report that conversations with him were among the most meaningful of their lives, yet they would be hard-pressed to identify anything specific that he had said. It was not the content of the communication but the quality from which it emerged that created the impact. He began to understand that this was how real teaching and influence always operated. It was not about transferring information or convincing others of particular viewpoints, but about creating conditions where truth could be recognized directly. When someone was completely present and available, without any agenda to convince or change, others felt safe to drop their defenses and discover what they already knew at the deepest level. The journey that had begun with strategic techniques for professional advancement had evolved into something that could hardly be called personal development at all. It was more like the dissolution of everything that was false, allowing what was eternally true to shine through without obstruction. The man who had once sought power through control and influence had discovered that true power emerged through the complete absence of seeking. The self that had seemed so important to develop and strengthen had revealed itself to be the primary obstacle to the expression of authentic capability and love. Yet this was not a nihilistic dissolution, but rather a recognition of what was beyond the personal while simultaneously expressing through it. The individual personality remained functional and appropriate, but it was no longer experienced as the source of action or the center of identity. From this recognition, every interaction became an opportunity for the expression of wisdom and love. Every challenge became a chance for creativity and growth to emerge. Every relationship became a space where mutual recognition and support could flourish. The fear and respect that others showed toward this transformed presence was ultimately recognition of their own deepest potential. They were responding not to something foreign or supernatural, but to the possibility that existed within themselves, the possibility of living from authenticity rather than programming, from love rather than fear, from wisdom rather than confusion. The obedience was not submission to external authority, but alignment with the truth that was recognized in his presence. When someone embodies genuine wisdom and love, others naturally want to learn from them and follow their example, not out of weakness but out of recognition of strength. The true power that emerged through this complete transformation was the power of life itself, the creative intelligence that was always seeking to express itself through every form and being. When the constructed self stepped aside completely, this intelligence could operate without interference, creating results that seemed miraculous from the perspective of ordinary consciousness. This was the ultimate meaning of destroying the weak self so completely that it could never again be destroyed by others. The self that could be threatened, manipulated, or defeated was revealed to be a fiction. What remained was invulnerable not because it was strong, but because it was not separate from the source of strength itself. The silence that had once been a tool became a way of being. The power that had once been sought became a natural expression. The transformation that had once been a goal became an ongoing recognition of what had always been true. In the end, the greatest influence emerged not through any technique or strategy, but through the simple authenticity of being completely present with what is. When someone embodies this quality consistently, they become a space where others can recognize and express their own deepest truth. This is the ultimate form of power, not power over others, but power that serves the awakening and flourishing of all life.